Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I take from the amount of noise that you're having a lovely time already. Perhaps not. AV, you're going to turn the mics up so you can hear the magic words I'm going to say this morning. So, the first thing I'm going to do, I know that you're agog at waiting to hear from our speakers, but I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do before we get there. So, first of all, my name's Sarah Carthew. I'm the Director of Development and Registrar of the Role here at Newnham. And I want to introduce you to Emma Menace, who is our comms person. So those of you who receive the monthly e-newsletters, this is who produces them. And I just want to say that along with Lucy Adrian, who has been absolutely instrumental with Jeremy, we have had an absolute blast putting this programme together. And I hope it shows that there's a plethora, and I never thought I'd use that word, a plethora of talks and ideas and things all about architecture. And at some stage, you are welcome to go and have a look at the Lego building, which will end up as a model of Old Hall, but also the skyline of Cambridge City. So there's lots of things happening, music, afternoon teas, you name it. But the major thing is that you feel at home and have whatever you please. We are here to serve. So, having said that, one of the things that we are also celebrating, not just 150 years of Old Hall, we're also celebrating where we've got to with the fundraising campaign. Now, don't all go, because this is a safe place. You are not going to be asked for any money here. But I just want you to know that we've got to 25.5 million, which has already broken the £25 million target that I was set, and we've still got a year to go. So I just want to say thank you to all of those who have given and all of those who perhaps might be thinking about giving. There is still time, but this is not a fundraising event at all. This is a safe place. So with no more ado, I will introduce our lovely speakers today. And as I say, Lucy has been, do you all know Lucy? Lucy has been here for many. Do stand up, Lucy, just so people can see. Lucy is one of Newnham's treasures. And as I say, we would not have managed this day without her and without Jeremy. So thank you very much indeed. So I'm of that age where I used to watch the two Ronnies. So in a packed programme today, I'm going to introduce you to Jeremy Musson and Tim Brittain Catlin. And you've got bios in your programme, so I'm not going to repeat them. I'm just going to say that we are enormously grateful for both of them coming today. They're going to talk in a sort of conversational way, and then there will be time for questions at the end. So you don't hear any more from me. So over to our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome and good morning to everyone. We decided to do this in a conversation. Tim is Professor of Architecture here at Cambridge, founder of the Architectural Apprentice Scheme, which has been a great pioneering element, although somewhat challenged by recent governmental funding decisions, which we'll talk about later. And also author, I knew he'd be too shy to bring it himself, but author of this absolutely amazing blockbuster book, a new look at Edwardian architecture, and particularly Edwardian domestic architecture, where really this country led the world for a handful of years. And it's all here in this book, which you can buy in any good bookshop. I'm also an architecture historian, and I do a lot of advisory work on historic buildings, including college complexes, and have known Tim a long time. And we have some also shared academic and writing interests. So we thought about talking to you about Newnham, the work of Basil Champneys at Newnham, and how it fits into that picture of England's evolving architecture as it moves towards this kind of Edwardian era, which is so fertile and so rich. We decided we wouldn't show you photographs.
As a conversation, may I suggest you come and sit here so that everyone, even at the back, can hear?
We're on AV, sir.
There are speakers at the back.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion.
That's absolutely fine. We are on AV. Everyone at the back happy? Yeah. So I think it'll work. And we're quite comfy in the chairs. But the point is there are buildings for you to look at outside. And you also got some expert lectures to come. Catlin Ferry is already here. Otto is already here. So you'll be seeing more slides in the course of the day. And we thought we'd be a slide-free conversation. But we would encourage you, as we have just done ourselves, to come and walk through these gardens, walk through these perfectly modelled buildings. They are a wonder. They are one of the treasures of Cambridge. We are in a city full of collegiate treasures, and Newnham is one of them.
I think it's also fair to say that they're looking better than they have ever done. The garden and the building condition and the rest of it, absolutely terrific. This is a college that does really value its buildings, and the whole setting, which is part of the story, is really fabulous here.
But anyway, we ought to start with a few, because of course some of you will know Newnham better than others. Some of you will have lived here. Some of you have long careers here. Some of you might be visiting for the first time. So we ought to say some general remarks that place Newnham and Basil Champneys for the audience. So Tim, just give us a bit of a quick intro to.
Well, this double act is the big picture essentially, because you'll have specialist talks on different aspects. And one of the most striking big pictures involved is the long life of the architect Basil Champneys, who was born in 1842 and he lived till beyond the age of 90 into the 1930s. So that means that his life and his career essentially span everything important that ever happened in British architectural history. And also the only, until the high-tech of the 1970s, the only period of British architectural history that has ever had deep influence and deep impact before. Now, Champneys was born in 1842. He was the son of the Dean of Lichfield. He was an undergraduate at Trinity College here. That's where he met Henry Sidgwick, the St. Fawcett's co-founder of the college, of course, and that's probably the key to the whole story. He worked for an architect called Pritchard for a bit, as an architect well known mostly in Wales for his domestic architecture, but he became part of an extremely influential circle of architects, many of whom had been assistants in the office of the great George Gilbert Scott, called George Gilbert Scott the first, as it were, the architect of St. John's College Chapel and much else, the Scott block of kings as well. Now, Scott is the kind of grandfather of everything that goes on to happen in the next generation. His own son, usually just simply called George Gilbert Scott Jr., was the architect of a fabulous building in Pembroke, the one that you can see from Pembroke Street with the angels carved into the corner. Very unusual and subtle and clever building. But another member of that circle was the architect J.J. Stevenson, who just down the road here carried out an architectural project which in fact has echoes to the present day, and that was the conversion of the granary building into a house for the member of the Darwin family. An awful lot of things are happening here. One is that this was a regular vernacular building of no formal architectural distinction, very attractive building, but nothing more than that. There's plenty like that everywhere. But it was turned into an extremely pretty and clever and sensitive house. The very conversion of old buildings into new ones, first of all, it becomes a major theme, much more, I think, than we had appreciated towards the end of the 19th century. But the second thing about that is that it is now, and I say this as an architecture school teacher, hugely significant, because now that architects have learnt that they must first of all look at an old building and see what they can do with it, as our distinguished architect Oliver Carroll in the front row here is doing all the time. That is the thing that we should all be doing for a lot of reasons. And Stevenson did it with enormous beauty and enormous care. A quick word about some of the other things that Champneys was up to, but it will be quick because I know that Otto is coming to this. Many of the buildings that he built in Oxford and Cambridge are fairly straightforward, 19th century, slightly Tudorish Gothic buildings. There is a tower, for example, in New College, Oxford, which is pretty similar to other ones. Mansfield College in Oxford is a very fine building, but it doesn't stand apart necessarily from the great mass of these buildings. But you can see the thing that Champneys was really good at in the former School of Divinity opposite St John's College, and in the Indian Institute in Oxford, and I think perhaps above all, for those of you who know the historic buildings of Manchester well, the Rylands Library. This is a form of Gothic which was described by Reggie Blomfield as picturesque Gothic. I think Reggie said this with a kind of air of dismissal slightly, but it's resulted in fabulously beautiful, carefully crafted buildings. And we're going to come to this in a bit, but covered in symbols of things that are important.
And I was going to say, just to rotate around Newnham for a moment.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the long life.
Yes.
Champneys was a long-living figure, which of course meant that he lived into an age when he was seen as his architecture was much overlooked. So I think at the time his obituaries,
But he also had he architected the college for 30 years.
That's the point I was coming to.
And that's pretty rare. The first example comes to mind is a very different one, which is Sir Frederick Gibbard was the architect of Harlow for about 30 years, of which he made every decision for everything that happened. So to have a very close connection to a particular site is enormously valuable for the architectural heritage of the college, because you can see the thought that is invested in every move.
And it brings us from that high Victorian period into the Edwardian era that we sort of referred to before. So this is evolving towards that very period.
Now let's talk about that period. Now the general style of the buildings here is called Queen Anne, and it's Queen Anne in inverted commas because it isn't that much to do with Queen Anne the person who had been around 200 years beforehand. Queen Anne in inverted commas is the name of the style which emerges mostly thanks to J.J. Stevenson, whom I mentioned earlier, but other very talented architects working, for example, on the Cadogan Estate in London in the 1870s, 1880s, and above all in the board schools. Now, the board schools, the story of the schools of the London School Board is again central to the big picture of Newnham's architectural history. The London School Board was a public body which had, for the first time of any substantial and influential public body, it had women members from the start, and as active members and as policy-making members. And this is a new thing, and it's telling you quite a lot about the aims and the ambitions of the school board, which was intended as non-denominational education that was available to all. It emerges from the Education Act of 1870. I look at Boyd's 1870. Yes, Forces Act 1870. So one of the first things that the London School Board does is that it holds a series of competitions to design the basic school types. The very first competition is won by Basil Champneys for a school which I think is no longer there, called Eel Pie Common Primary School in Fulham, but it establishes the type, which is tall rooms, Dutch features, or sort of English version of Dutch features, ornamented gables, very tall chimneys. I hope you've all noticed how beautiful the chimneys are in this college. Really, actually, something worth a lot of thought. It's worth sending the apprentices to, I think. And Champneys sets out the prototype. Other architects, Stevenson is one of them, build these buildings right the way across London. They're sometimes being described, when you see them from the railways, you have to imagine the scene from the railways up until recent times in central London. We're looking over a lot of terraced housing quite deep, and suddenly this building rises like a lighthouse above it. They are enormously.
Don't they get a special reference in a Sherlock Holmes story?
They get a lot of reference, a lot of
buildings. Where they're going on the train out to Surrey or something, and Sherlock Holmes sees a board school, and he says, "There they are. Lighthouses of learning,
that's where that comes
beacons
from.
Of hope."
Yes, beacons of hope. That's what they were intended to be, and that's what they were. They were very high quality building, but what I think is valuable in many ways is that they set a type, which means that other people could do similar ones without having to think out the problem all over again. And these buildings were very, as well as the educational system which they represented, these buildings were very heavily published. They were much visited by delegations of architects and municipal delegations from abroad. And Champneys is in there right from the start, and he is in there with the same elements of building that you see around here. Now that's the style called Queen Anne. It evolves into something else at the beginning of the 20th century, which we will come to in a bit. But that is the style which is sometimes referred to by the phrase "sweetness and light," the title of the great and much missed Marc Girouard's book about the period, which talks not only about the architecture but also about the societies such as Newnham, which created them. One of the points that Marc makes in that book is that the original Newnham shareholder non-profit making company, which Sidgwick and Millicent Fawcett set up, had a lot of very young women members in
20s and 30s.
20s and 30s. Yeah, and this is all part of the idea that the buildings which are not heavy with ornament and which are not dark, Pugin, the creator of the Gothic revival in England, his buildings were always dark and slightly damp and endlessly. And his response when his usually convent clients told him this was to shut up and just do what he said. They said, well, all these dark
architects
rooms,
never say that.
No, they never say that sort of thing. There is one of them, the famous Bermondsey, the Bermondsey convent, the Mother Superior complained you had to stand on a chair to be able to look out of the window. And all this. So they are moving consciously away from that, and that generation is part of that move away towards cheerful, bright architecture.
I mean,
brings the outside.
We don't want to introduce a note of competition here, but of course Girton is the parallel story.
Yes, it's very
Cambridge
different,
at the time, which
yes.
of course follows a much
more
serious Gothic moral tone in its architecture.
You can see the break. In fact, Jeremy was mentioning this just yesterday, which is that Alfred Waterhouse was the architect, as you know, of some very substantial buildings across Cambridge, from Girton down to Pembroke. And it was probably the ejection of Waterhouse from Pembroke and the decision to remodel and extend and restore Christopher Wren's chapel at Pembroke with George Gilbert Scott Jr. As the architect for doing this. It's probably that moment where the university, the colleges move away from the kind of moral superiority of
the story of Gothic, which
yeah.
has been a very defining element in the Cambridge topography. So the reinvention of Gothic from the 1820s onwards. Cambridge was not such an obviously Gothic place until the 19th century.
No, that's quite right. And there are buildings that went back to being Gothic. Magdalen College was Georgianized, the double-hung vertical sliding sash windows, and all that went out at the beginning of the 19th century, then went out again when it made it look in inverted commas Tudor. So the buildings move around all the time.
And it does mean that therefore Newnham is an adventure in architecture.
Yes, it's an adventure.
It's much more novel.
Yeah, it's a young person's
we
adventure.
realise today, because of where it sits.
That's right.
And got a lot of interest because of it, I think.
Yeah, and I think that now you might well think, where is this coming from? We know that there's some first-class designers such as Stevenson and the younger Scott and so on. But Champneys is bringing more elements to it. The way in which he originally made his name was as the author of an illustrated book that's called A Pretty and Quiet, what is it called? It's a pretty quiet building, corner of England. Quiet little corner of England, that's it. Now, in 1875, he writes a book which is extolling the beauties of Rye. Rye actually was Brittified at the beginning of the 20th century. Rye then didn't look like it does now. But what he was so enthusiastic about, and this is very typical for that generation of architects, was this sort of jumble of pretty styles of different eras, because what the late Victorian architects, the early 20th century architects were so interested in, and it comes out of this care with which they remodeled and changed existing buildings, moved things around, as Oliver's great-grandfather so famously did at Van. One bit of the house ends up somewhere else. All this moving, it means knowing the bits of historic architecture extremely well. Now, the Gothic revival was very like international modernism in a way, in that it absolutely brooked no opposition. And I remember this myself as a student, which was that there was only the true modern style, and that was it, and there was no conversation to be had about any of it. And if you did anything else, you were in some way a bad person. What the modernists did, we won't do it right now, but I can tell you a story about your rare books library, which absolutely exemplifies this. But they got all this from the Gothic revivalists. The Gothic revivalists were no compromise, weren't they? They were, what's that Spanish phrase? No pass around. You were not, you absolutely could not budge an inch. Whereas the next generation, probably no doubt, like every generation, rebelling somewhat against their bosses and their partners, it was the compromise that they liked. They liked, in particular, in picturesque towns like Rye, what they especially liked, they liked this more than anything else, was the combination of early 17th century architecture with late 17th century architecture. So it was not at all unusual by the time you get to the late 1880s, 1890s, the great glorious era when Newnham really takes its distinct modern shape, you would get often in many buildings a building that was apparently Jacobean on the outside, and it was William and Mary on the inside. Now, if you think about it, it's very difficult to resolve those kinds of detailing as an architect, because you're putting classical paneling and white painted pillars and so on up against Jacobean stone mullioned windows or fireplaces. It's a difficult thing to do, but they loved it. They loved doing it. Country Life, at the end of the 19th century, publishes a series of articles showing how windows, doors, chimneys were done in a vernacular fashion across the different counties of England. And what that means, therefore, is that more architects can find the information. Batsford publishes books about these. So there is a kind of explosion, just as in the beginning of the 19th century, there had been an explosion of accurate information about medieval buildings that there had never been before. At the end of the 19th century, in Newnham's era, there was an explosion of information about how 17th and 18th century craftsmen were making things and how you fit them together. Now, that's one part of the story, but let me move away from style to something which is, in a way, I think, much more significant part of, of the bigger picture, which Newnham is part of. And that is the interest in accommodation for women in high quality living circumstances, which is very difficult to achieve in late 19th century England. If you work in a shop, for example, it's very hard to find decent accommodation in the 1880s. Now, one big difference, you know this from H.G. Wells, apart from anything else, is that in that period, it was much more normal for an employer to provide accommodation. So very often in Wells's own case, it's the case in Kipps too, isn't it? That the young people in the shop all lived upstairs in one of the bedrooms. Now, the more philanthropic-minded organisations and funds, and also the more philanthropic employers, John Lewis, for example, build accommodation for women who work in the shops. You can still see it around Bolsover Street in Marylebone. That's when they've only recently have they become expensive flats for everybody else, but they were built as salubrious, pleasant, safe accommodation for women with community areas and community dining and so on. And there are plenty of really fine buildings that are doing this. Jeremy and I were in Hampstead Garden Suburb the other day. We saw Waterloo Court by Bailey Scott, which was intended precisely to be that. It's a cloister-like building, isn't it? Around a courtyard with high quality rooms. When you look at the photographs, and they've got some photographs on display in their entry, they look very like the early photographs and drawings of rooms in Newnham. That is the thing. So there is a distinct interest in how to provide high quality architecture for communities of women. And that's new, never happened before. Well, it was easy for men to find accommodation, that's all it is. I think it's because there was an identified special need, I think, is what generates it.
I know you said you wanted to veer away from the art and craft side of things, but it did strike me when you were beginning to list then, of the qualities of Newnham that we think of. There is the red brick architecture, there are the sash windows, painted white casement windows, that sort of air of lively late 17th, early 18th century cheerful architecture. But the quality of the rubbed brickwork, the quality of the plasterwork, the quality of the joinery throughout from the beginning to the end of Champneys' contribution is really outstanding.
Yes, it's extremely high. This group of architects are in the forefront of pioneering extremely high quality of building. Before the First World War, what you might call ordinary house building is of the highest quality that it ever was, before. I mean, you might not think much of it nowadays, but at least you can say nowadays there is an endless cycle of improvement of the quality of building, even if it's been pretty ropey in previous decades. But Edwardian house building is generally extremely high quality technically, even in the smallest houses. There are relatively small spaces in Newnham. We went to see the laboratory earlier, for example, where the standard is extremely high. The standards didn't drop for smaller buildings. This is the period of the garden suburbs, the garden cities, Port Sunlight I was reading about recently. There is a lot of press interest in it. Jeremy's distinguished predecessor, Lawrence Weaver, wrote books about the design of cottages. And essentially, by the time you get to the First World War, the problem of how to design a house is solved. There isn't anything that people don't know how to do really well. So we're talking here about ventilation, about cupboards, about kitchens, staircases, where the window should be in relation to the bed. All that stuff is completely sorted. Now, that's very down to earth, but let's take that in a different direction. This coincides, the sweetness and light movement in architecture coincides, of course, with the aesthetic movement generally. And there are some who see the aesthetic movement as being a kind of development of the pre-Raphaelite movement. Now, you think of the images from that period. The first thing that you notice is that there are plants and flowers everywhere, to the extent that Punch cartoons are making fun of it. Towards the end of that period, it seems a bit ludicrous that there is a beautiful bowl of geraniums in every drawing room. But it is really central to the whole thing. And of course, it's central to the whole layout of Newnham as an open garden and not as a closed court. You can see that the relationship, and it's true also of this new Waters and Cone building, look out of the windows into the college direction, and you can see the green is part of it. It's almost a green wall behind you, in fact. Now, this is a very major theme in the aesthetic movement. Look at Champneys buildings, and you will see plants all over the place. I noticed in the Divinity School this morning, for example, the carving around the archivolts of the entranceway into the building, for example, are exquisitely done. But it's here too in many, many details. It's here in the plasterwork of the ceiling of Clough Hall, for example. Sometimes, towards the end of the century, it moves a bit towards what Europeans were doing, towards the more symbolist themes. So flowers that mean things, for example, and slightly stylized plants that are tended to talk about something that is beyond the experience of everyday life. But that is a very important part of it, I think.
So we talked about, therefore, the detail, the quality, the putting together, and you began to sort of hint at the setting. It always seems to me that, again, one of the outstanding qualities of Newnham is this garden setting, which was sort of developed. It wasn't initially quite possible in the way that it came to be.
Yeah, the site was pretty bleak, I think, probably to start with.
And yet it is, we see it now as one of the sort of great features of Newnham.
Yes.
Presumably people responded to that at the time.
Oh, yes, they did. But also you see it in other places. Now, the Edwardian period, the late Victorian period, the Edwardian period is also a high point. I mean, be careful here because there'll be specialists in the audience. But it is a high point in children's literature for sure. And that's both in illustrated books and in written books. So there is an enormous amount of description of what beautiful gardens and houses should look like. If you look at drawings usually reproduced as lithographs of Randolph Caldecott, for example, you'll see examples of houses which are essentially a kind of jumble of 17th century styles in the background. And in the foreground, there will be a beautiful rose garden or something. I mean, these things have enormous impact. You see it in Kate Greenaway. There's something also in those lithograph colours, isn't there? The pink, the pale pink and the pale green lithographs. Water Crane is another one doing it on tiles and in other places. So that appears everywhere. This is it is an English thing. The history of 19th century architecture and early 20th century design in continental Europe, in Germany in particular, is completely different from how it is in England. In Europe, they teach their students semper, for example. The English never do and never have. We had the Gothic revival instead, and it was better. But it's true also at the end of the period, and where you see it imitated on the continent, it's consciously imitated from what's happening in England. Let me give you another example, because this is more literary than visual. The books of E. Nesbit, for example, are very subtle and very clever in talking about houses and in gardens. And a lot of what happened, a lot of jokes in E. Nesbit is very well looking at it back. I always read these by my mother, how many years ago was it? Late 50 years ago, and she'd been read them by her mother, and her mother had an aunt who gave them to her as they came out, and including the first edition of the Secret Garden, I'd like to say, on Distant Stream. It's absolutely high periods. The Secret Garden itself, well, that speaks for itself probably. It's a very well-known story. But in the case of the Nesbit books, the revival of houses in gardens is a thing that keeps on coming back. In Harding's Luck, which is in many ways one of the most fascinating of all of them, there is a kind of backstory is created that takes place in the Jacobean house in the big garden in Deptford. It's based on, what was his name, Otto? John, what was he called? The one who had the big garden in Deptford. Can't remember. You told me about it once. There's a lot of stuff about bringing houses into gardens, or in words as well as in pictures. In that point.
And that point makes me think of one of the themes that we were talking about before this event, which is, as we've set that title, the Harbinger of Edwardian architecture, and its long summer. How can we sort of summarize a bit how the ideas of Newnham feed, Champneys' decades of work at Newnham, how does it feed into the Edwardian architectural scene subsequently? For instance, does he influence university architecture at all?
Not much,
no.
But it influences other things. Now, for example, interior decoration. Now, I don't know whether, although possibly Otto does, whether Champneys had any particular clear views about the interior design of buildings beyond the applied plasterwork and so on. But what is the case is that high-class, good taste in English interior design starts to mirror what you see around you here at Newnham. It does it partly in copying the floral decorations on, but it does it a bit more profoundly than that. One of the interesting things that happens, for example, is that furniture designed by architects in particular starts to copy themes that you can see in the buildings. That's not unusual. It does happen. There were plenty of people, for example, in a very different type of period in the Bauhaus, where their furniture designers are kind of copying the buildings rather than the other way around. You think it'd be the other way around, wouldn't you? But it isn't. The buildings are higher up the food chain than furniture. So there is an illustration in Mark Girouard's book, for example, of a cabinet designed by Maurice B. Adams, who was an architect of houses, also the editor of the Building News. And that cabinet is essentially made out of the bits of Clough Hall. It's got two curved glazed cabinets at the front of it. So it appears like that. Now, there are illustrations emerge. I mentioned the early images that we have of this college, that what the students' rooms looked like at the time. And that also filters through, rooms absolutely stuffed with plates, china, silverware, and so on, all absolutely perfect, good taste, arranged on overmantels with enormous care, carpets, Chippendale, Sheraton in inverted commas, all that stuff is coming at, all that fashion is launched from here. Now, just say one other word about what happens afterwards. It's worth it only for a quick sentence, I think, because it's an obscure, but again, a very English chapter of history, and that is the Quality Street style that emerges at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, you know about Quality Street from the tins of sweets, don't you? It's that Quality Street, right? It's partly that, but it's where that comes from, which is the play by J.M. Barrie. The Quality Street style takes the architect's favourite bits of early 18th century architecture and sticks onto it their favourite bits of early 19th century architecture. So Regency things, shallow shallow bows, for example, and kind of pretty ornamental ironwork on balconies and so on. This makes a big appearance towards the end of the Edwardian era, and the place where you see it most is in the area around Smith Square, which now I wouldn't say that of this audience, but many audiences might have thought the area around Smith Square in Westminster was a pretty untouched Queen Anne corner of London. It's no such thing. It's a completely Edwardian creation. Design, and the houses in it that look like they should be 1700 are actually probably by Maurice Field in about 1910, but they're done so well that they're done better than the ones that they were copied from in the first place. That style kind of degenerates and it becomes a sort of slightly old fusspot style by the time you get to the 1930s. But it does go on. Leaving.
There's a very good chapter on this, by the way, in this book, which I might have mentioned earlier, which I think is one of the most riveting and original chapters in the book, actually. Because
I had no idea about it. I mean, I should have done, but I didn't. It's also partly to do with the history of the Liberal Party. The Liberal control, the Progressive Party, which was a kind of front for the Liberal Party, controls the London County Council. That area where all those pretty Queen Anne houses were was wharves. There was gasworks there, for example. There were some modern, that's to say, mid-Victorian office buildings, and it's turned into the London version of Newnham. Which is something worth thinking about, I think. Let's say something else, Jeremy, about the impact. I said rather bluntly, it doesn't have an impact on the architecture in the university. I don't think it does. That might be a generational thing. But of course, where it does reappear is in the campus universities that were designed in the 1960s. Because there, the landscape and the buildings were designed from the start to be complementary to each other. It's obviously particularly true of the University of York, for instance. It's less true of the ones that were, in a slightly counter-intuitional way, imitating the inner city, such as University of Essex, which is a sort of brutalist suburb in the middle of nowhere. But it's certainly true of it's true to some extent of Sussex. It's definitely true of York. It was always intended to be true of York. It's true to some extent of the University of Kent. One of the problems those universities had was that the architecture of the buildings did not really live up much to the quality of the landscaping that they were planned to be with. But you can see easily in buildings, for example, University of York is a very good one in this respect, that they are intended to be picturesque landscapes with little garden scenes, lakes, roses, and so on. And that comes from here. I mean, people are always trying to imitate the architecture of Cambridge colleges because they're nice.
I think there are.
Yes.
Really bossy. I really, really don't want to interrupt the flow, but time is moving, and I know that there will be people in the audience. When you've already alluded to, you might want to ask us.
Okay. So what time are we finishing then?
We're going to finish at 11.
Oh, sorry. It said 11:15 on our note. I'm happy to go to questions now.
We'll stay as long as you want us to stay, and then we'll go.
Okay, we'll go on to
11:10.
Excellent compromise.
Right.
There we go.
Well, should we have a? Shall we
yes.
move straight to questions? Although
Yeah.
I did want to say something about university architecture because I think there are buildings in Cambridge that show a response to Newnham. I think it's called the Hostel at Emmanuel, which was a rather sort of raw red brick block. Pearson comes on and adds wings in the 1890s and gives it dormers and sort of fretwork, sort of fretted brickwork, which I'm sure is a direct response to the more garden-esque and sort of pleasure ornamental sort of roof outlines of Newnham. I also think we talked about the importance of brick and the craft expression of brick at Newnham, but I see it very much in the same family as the sort of articulated, loosely Jacobean that becomes the Edwardian freestyle work, which we see a lot of in the universities, Oxford and Cambridge. T.G. Jackson and people. It has something of that as well.
Yes, it does. And one thing I've noticed as I mean, part of the job of running an apprenticeship is that you see what is happening in practices of all kinds, but you don't need to hear it from me. You can look around this wonderful new building and look at the brickwork here, is that there has been a major return to the sensitivity of working in brick. Brick is usually easily and cheaply available. everybody knows how to work it. What was missing was a bit of imagination about what to do with it. If you look at the best of the recent private estates, privately built estates outside the centre of Cambridge, Great Knighton, for example, the estate by Procter & Matthews, got fabulous brickwork in it. And there are enough first-class architects who are doing this now for it to begin to constitute a kind of style, isn't it? We're looking at the Allies and Morrison building on the way in, for instance. It sits very happily in the site of Newnham as a whole, I think. So there is that as well. There are longer term.
Well, I think you're hearing from the architect of this building later.
Great.
Sure
yes.
And that's very much the theme of the talk, I think.
Yeah.
How it's drawn
Yeah,
from the exemplars here.
Mm.
But Tim, I'm going to then draw our conversation to a close and open up to questions from the floor. But it's been a great pleasure, as always. We could go on all day, I think.
We often do.
I warn you, we often do, don't we? And sometimes just on the phone as well.
Yes.
But it is a wonderful, I think, before we go into questions, I'd just like to say that, I go back to what I said at the beginning. Newnham is an outstanding group of buildings. It deserves to be better known. I was very pleased to see amongst the new presentational elements is a history of the architecture on the walls of one of the corridors.
Yes, excellent.
So as you walk through the building, it's always worried me when I sometimes work with Oliver Carrow on sort of college, understand, the conservation plans for colleges. How do the undergraduates and the inhabitants get to know the story of their buildings? And often in fact, one project, I think I interviewed them and they said, oh, we have chats in the Porter's Lodge with the porters, and that's about as much. And I said, wasn't there a guidebook? And they said, is there? Obviously a lot of websites have, including Newnham, have fantastic histories. But I'm not sure students necessarily want to sort of surf historic websites. But actually to have it as you walk down this corridor is a very good idea. And I hope that people who've been at Newnham, including Mrs. Musson, who's sitting at the back, as undergraduates, carry away a sense of pride in the architecture that we see consolidated here. And as Tim was saying earlier on, beautifully kept. I think the gardens look better than when I first visited 30 years ago. So 30, 40, who knows? So anyway, very much delighted to. But thank you, Tim. And actually, I think, can we thank Tim now, because he's taken really.